In the Thomas and Friends fandom, there seems to be an unofficial initiation process. The first rule is the love of Thomas and Friends. Pretty straightforward. Second rule is admitting that season 5 is the greatest season ever, which is not a deal breaker. The third is creating some form of original Thomas content, such as a YouTube channel or fanfiction. And finally, you have to have an unbearable disdain for the season 10 episode, Edward Strikes Out. I'm not exaggerating when I say that this episode is reviled in the Thomas and Friends community. Search for the episode online and you'll find articles and videos chastising this episode, and also an abundance of fan adaptations on how you could improve it. There's no denying that the episode is flawed, but is it really that bad? I left Edward Strikes Out off my ranking videos list because I wasn't impressed with it, but I didn't despise it as much as the fandom makes it out to be. I could have easily jumped on the bandwagon and said what everybody else says about the episode, but I was too conflicted. So join me, your Ginger Engine, as I take on yet another Herculean task, trying to defend the episode Edward Strikes Out. If you've watched my playlist about the hit era, you might be surprised that not only am I defending this episode, but an episode from this era. I don't deny that it's a step down from the classic era, but it doesn't mean there aren't some gems in there. And from what I've seen so far, it's a damn sight better than the Sharon Miller era. Speaking of which, this episode was written by Sharon Miller, and I imagine it's a big part of why the fandom don't like her as much in the writing sense. But I don't think the writing itself is actually bad in this episode. I would even go as far to say that it's pretty solid. It hits the necessary beats of an episode from this era. New engine arrives on Sodor, other engines think it's strange and aren't very fond of it. New engine proves himself in the end, job's a good one. And it lacks some of the well-known Miller-isms that come into play in later episodes, such as the 3-strike formula, with Edward's trucks collapsing and Gordon's crash accounting for 2 strikes. There's no rhyming speech in the episode, and not all of the characters are flanderized because Edward isn't the old, frail, pathetic Edward that we've seen in the hit era up to this point. But that's also what a lot of people don't like about the episode. Edward is so out of character in terms of the Railway series, the classic era, and the hit era that it sent everybody into meltdown. But for me, I actually didn't mind it. I'm not saying that it wasn't annoying and it didn't initially make me feel upset. Then I watched the rest of the hit era and rewatched the previous episodes with Edward in it. And having Edward as old and pathetic actually upset me more than this did. At least in this episode, there was a bit of fight about him. He wasn't worrying about how he was going to pull a heavy train, or if he was going to be scrapped, or not ask Percy how to pull a mail train. In this episode, he did his job, he had no insecurities about it, and stood up for himself. Yes, it was wrong in how he portrayed all these character traits, but I much preferred this over the old, pathetic, frail Edward. You know what it made me think about? All the members of the fandom who say that the hit era Scarloway episodes would work better if they were set as prequels rather than in present day. I think this also would work better as an Edward prequel story. This episode is showing what Edward was like in his younger days and advising other engines not to make the same mistakes that he did. Yes, it would require rewrites in the same way that other members of the fandom talk about episodes like Scarloway the Brave, but the principle's still the same. And don't say that Edward wouldn't act like a prick if he was younger. We were all young once, we were all pricks, and we all did stupid things. So it's very easily done. Speaking of pricks, a major debate around this episode is that it would be better if Edward was replaced by another engine, say James or Emily. But I think having Edward in the lead role was the right call, but for the wrong reasons. Let's do a little thought experiment. We're going to travel back in time to the year 2005. Thomas and Friends has just come off the back of its 9th season. Episodes are being churned out at breakneck speed due to a very aggressive schedule, and the quality of said episodes are in decline. Sharon Miller has written this episode, but in her first draft, the lead character is James. It's presented to Steve Asquith, who likes the story, but not James as the lead character. Why? Too predictable. Everyone and their grandparents would predict the outcome of this story if James was the lead character. Sharon Miller rewrites the story, but with, let's say, Emily in the lead role. And again, it's rejected. Why? Politics. Thomas and Friends already has a growing reputation of being a sexist show with no integral female characters. They've tried to rectify this by making Emily their token girl character, and having her perceived as a complete bitch is not going down well. Do you really want to double down on it by making her a racist as well? One of the requirements of the episode is that the lead character has to be an engine from the STEAM team. Thomas already has a plethora of them. Percy has Percy in the Funfair and the Green Controller. James has James the second best. Henry has Big Strong Henry. Gordon has It's Good to Be Gordon. Toby has Toby's Afternoon Off. And Emily has Emily and the Special Coaches. So who's the only engine left from the STEAM team that doesn't have a lead episode? You guessed it, and it's Edward. And it worked. Because whether you like it or not, Edward Strikes Out lives rent-free in many of the fandom's heads. It is now infamous in the fandom. If this was a James-led episode, the only thing that I would take note of from it is it would be another bit of evidence in my James is a ball bag video. It would be a mere footnote in a 24-season long franchise. There's a saying in the entertainment industry: there's no such thing as bad press. Edward Strikes Out is a prime example of this. Of course, all of that is speculation. I am not saying that this is what happened, but it makes sense. Since we are doing these little thought experiments, let's go into a theory of mine about why this episode isn't that bad with Edward in the lead role, and it revolves around Rocky, and in particular, his basis as a crane engine. I believe that Edward disliking Rocky because he's a crane is in character for him, because Rocky and Harvey will eventually get rid of the original breakdown trains. Now this is a wild one, but bear with me. The breakdown trains have been around since the very beginning of the series. They were based on the Cowens-Sheldon Standard, constructed from 1890 to 1910. As many of the fandom know, Edward is based on a heavily modified Sharp, Stewart and Company larger Seagull K2 engine, which was built in 1896 and again in 1900. Based on these construction dates, Edward and the breakdown trains are roughly the same age, which stands to reason that Edward and the breakdown trains were probably brought to the island of Sodor at the same time. So if Edward is considered old by steam engine standards, the breakdown trains fall into this category as well. With the engines in Sodor, new, more up-to-date engines are brought in to either help with the workload, or in the same vein as diesels coming to the island, replace steam engines altogether. New crane engines would eventually need to be brought to the island of Sodor on this same basis. Edward has proven time and time again how useful he can be, even with new engines trying to usurp him. But that's because he has the capability to do so. At this point in the franchise's history, the breakdown trains had no such sentience. They couldn't speak up and say that they could still do the job even if they were almost broken. So if the breakdown trains ever broke down, what would happen to the island of Sodor? Who would solve this problem? Enter Harvey in season 6. Harvey is very elegantly described as cranky on wheels by some of the engines, with Edward even saying that he doesn't look like an engine. Harsh words, especially from Edward. But peel back the layers and Edward does have cause for concern. Edward is quite likely worried about the breakdown trains, fellow elder statesmen of the railway like himself, being scrapped because of this new engine. After all, Harvey is a sentient crane engine who can move under his own steam. He can go to any accident on his own and simply clear away the damage. He's also new, and by that standing, more useful than the breakdown trains. Harvey could very well replace them, and there is not a damn thing anyone can do about it. And if the Fat Controller can do that with the breakdown trains, could he do that to an engine like Edward? It's a possibility. But there is one thing that manages to calm Edward's worries. Harvey has limitations. Sure, he can lift trucks, coaches, and sometimes even smaller engines like Percy, but it would be more of a challenge for him to lift a bigger engine like Gordon. So Harvey can be used to pull the breakdown trains to any bigger job that he can't do on his own. And it makes sense because Harvey is a crane engine. If it's a smaller incident, just use Harvey. If it's a bigger incident, he takes the breakdown trains with him. So the old breakdown trains still have a purpose, a use, if you will. And this is what calms Edward's worries and leads him to come around to having Harvey as part of the island of Sodor's team. And for a few more seasons it stays that way. and all is right with the world until Edward strikes out. With Rocky arriving on Sodor, the breakdown trains are under threat yet again. Rocky is a ransoms and rapier 45-ton steam crane, which was built in 1945. So not only is he 50 years younger than the breakdown trains, but he can easily do the job of both of them with ease. So when Edward sees this new crane engine, he is threatened on their behalf. This combination of Harvey, a crane who can move under his own steam, and big strong Rocky make the breakdown train's irrelevance to Sodor no longer a case of if, but when. And this is proven as we never see the breakdown trains again until the adventure begins, and then in season 20, when they are finally found on a siding in Knapford after becoming obsolete due to Rocky being stronger than the both of them combined. So when Gordon points out the one flaw that Rocky has, having no engine, Edward jumps on it, because he's trying to justify not only the breakdown train's importance to the railway, but his own importance as well. This would explain his drastic attitude change in this episode, as he has been old and weak and pathetic in the hit era so far. Now it looks like his old friends are going to become obsolete, so he decides to act like the youngest, most arrogant, overconfident engine that he knows, James. Edward being rude to Rocky's face is very uncomfortable to watch, but with this theory it now makes more sense, as Edward is defending his comrades, the very breakdown trains that Rocky is going to replace. With Edward in this mood, it's very likely that even if he ran into Spencer, he would rip him a new tender and send him crying back to Boxford. When Edward eventually has his accident with the falling pipes, the right thing to do would be to phone Rocky, but instead he phones for Harvey. Why? Most likely, Edward thought that Harvey would bring the original breakdown trains with them, as it is a big job. This would have proven that the breakdown trains were still useful to the railway, and that they didn't need this newfangled nonsense like Rocky on Sodor. Unfortunately, Harvey comes on his own, and it looks like Edward's plans are up in smoke. Many people have questioned how Harvey can find it so difficult to lift pipes on his own, yet in his debut episode he was able to lift Percy. But I think this job is more difficult for Harvey for two reasons. Number one, the first incident was his debut episode, and he was most likely trying to push himself to prove to the railway board that he was useful and worthwhile staying on the railway. So quite likely he probably overdid it. Now he's been on Sodor for a while, and he probably knows his limitations. Number two, repeating the same lift and lay job with the pipes over and over again, no matter how heavy, will eventually start to take their toll. It's like any other physically demanding task. You do it for so long, it will eventually wear you down, and in turn makes you tired. The pipes may look light, but if there's one thing that this franchise has taught us, it's never to underestimate little things. So while Harvey not bringing the breakdown trains is a spanner in the works for Edward's plan, it's not necessarily a deal breaker. If Harvey can clear the accident on his own, it would still prove that Rocky isn't needed, and like Edward, going slow and steady sometimes wins the race. But the next two incidents scupper this entirely. Thomas and Emily turning up, needing the line cleared quickly, and Gordon crashing into the pipes. Now there's not only a real need for urgency, but also great strength, as Harvey is not able to lift Gordon on his own, and to do so would probably cause even more problems. This causes Edward to concede and finally go and get Rocky, who in turn wins Edward over with his abilities. Sadly though, this does mean that the breakdown train's fates are sealed, and they aren't seen again until much later in the franchise. For normies, this may seem like a ridiculous amount of analysis for a Thomas and Friends episode, and you're probably right, but this was done for a reason. So many people on social media these days are obsessed with being completely right or completely wrong. There is no room for a middle ground, and if you don't agree with either side, you are ostracised. It feels like there's no room for healthy debate anymore, and Edward Strikes Out is a prime example of this. I found absolutely no positive reviews of this episode, or even saying that the episode was just fine. It was all negatives, and that's not okay to me. Like it or not, the episode was made with the best of intentions, to create a story to entertain children. Is it a good episode? No. But is it an abomination like so many people make it out it is? Also no. I always say that the one thing that makes the Thomas fandom so unique is that our opinions can differ, and we can respect those opinions. But the hate towards this episode, however, puts us all in a bad light. And I don't want that. I love being a part of this fandom. Edward Strikes Out isn't bad, but it's not good. It's the definition of a fairly middling episode. You feel various different emotions, have differing opinions, but ultimately don't feel that strongly about it one way or the other. So for me, Edward Strikes Out is my definitive meh episode. And you know what? That's okay. Thank you for watching, and until next time, keep on chugging.